Hello friends, today we'll be talking about Deadhouse Gates. So before we get into Deadhouse Gates, I always like to mention before these videos that I like to keep things spoiler free. I'm not going to give you a beat by beat of what happens. I'll give you my takeaways and my thoughts, and you can decide if the book is for you or not for you. With a series like this, I will not be spoiling anything from the first book or from this book. Completely spoiler free. It's just my takeaways coming out off the second book and rolling into the third here soon. So if you watched my review of Gardens of the Moon or our group discussion for it, I was a little confused after that one. It was a lot of things going on, and the writing style seemed a little bit off to me. While I enjoyed it, I was a little confused. So I'm glad that I'm reading this with a group and able to pick brains of people much smarter than I am to help me understand what the heck is going on. But I will say that going into Deadhouse Gates, I was, I'm into it. I enjoyed the first book. So heading into Deadhouse Gates, right off the bat, in the prologue, I loved the prologue. It is so great. And it is much darker than I anticipated. And I'll get to that more here in a second. But the prologue, there was just this feeling you get going into this book that you just didn't get in the first book, at least for me. This book is much more accessible. The writing style just seems a little different. I can't explain to you what exactly it is. Maybe it's me adapting, or maybe it's just the style is a little bit different. But I did feel like this book is a much easier read and much easier to keep track of. And that's not to say that there's not a lot going on. There's a lot of characters in this book. There's a ton of them. And off the first book, we have a foundation laid for some of them. And so that made things easier to keep track of. You have, you kind of have a sense for the world and what's going on. You kind of have some, like, a foundation to work off of, like I said. But the first bit of it was a little difficult to keep track of. There's a lot of characters. The chapters are long, and that's I think Gardens of the Moon had the same structure with chapters. I think the chapters being shorter would have made it a little bit easier to keep track of who's who. I did find myself taking notes during this one just to keep track of who's who and referring back to the front of the book for the list of characters. The list of characters in the front of the book has 88 characters listed. So there's a lot of characters in this one. And this book is much darker than I anticipated it being. And I've heard some people kind of scoff at the idea that this is grimdark, but and it's difficult because everyone has their own interpretation of their own definition of grimdark. And some people see it as like an insult for some reason, or it's like a dirty word. But if this isn't grimdark, I don't know. At least for me. I mean, I know some people have different definitions, but all the characters are morally gray. There's some really dark and disturbing scenes. The characters do some things that don't typically happen in traditional fantasy that I've read anyway. So I'm curious to see, and this is just a discussion. This is just throwing it out there just for a discussion. I know some people get weird about this kind of thing, but in your opinion, is this grimdark? Because I'm curious to see what all of you think. And don't get me wrong, I love grimdark. I'm a huge fan of the darker books, the dark and gritty type of stories. So I dug it. I think it's great, but I'm just curious to see what the rest of you think who have read it. And there is one specific character that I'm sure we'll get into during the live show. And if the live show happens, once the live show happens, I'll add it here to the cards. But there's one character in particular that I've heard previously that people had trouble with the way this character is portrayed. But I think given the situation, I think I didn't have really, it was a disturbing and tragic story for the character, but I didn't really see it as out of bounds or anything like that. But that's something we'll get into that more in the spoiler talk during the live discussion, I'm sure. And those of you who have this edition of the book, this book is 600 pages long. This edition is, but the text is wall to wall. It goes all the way down to the bottom of the page. So I've heard some other editions are like 1,000 pages. It's like, yeah, I can kind of see that because it is just wall to wall. And I love the construction of this book. I received this book from Amazon. I love the The trades, I love the flop. I love the floppy trades. And the cover is just so great. I love that cover. And the construction, like I said, the construction of the book is pretty good. The pages are a little thin, but not too bad. It's a long book. And I did feel like the story dragged along at times. There were some times when I kind of felt my eyes glossing over, that things just weren't moving at the pace I expected them to move. But the last 100 pages or so, things really happen. Things happen. Things happen at the last. Things happen throughout the book, but the last bit of it was pretty good. Pretty good.
Pretty good.
And I've heard some people tell me that they kind of threw in the towel at Deadhouse Gates. If they got through Gardens of the Moon, they got to Deadhouse Gates and they threw in the towel. And I can kind of see why people, this would be the point where people kind of fall off, because it's a different type of, at least for me, it was a different type of read. There's a lot happening, and it was difficult sometimes to keep track of who's who. Overall, I enjoyed it. It's not my favorite series or my favorite book, but overall, I did enjoy it. I appreciate the complexity, the depth of the characters. I appreciate in a way, I appreciate the challenge that this one was for me to keep track of who's who. I think for me, it was a challenging read. It took an extra amount of attention. I think sometimes we read, I think all of us do this. Sometimes we kind of go into like autopilot and we're reading, but not really reading. These are the kind of books that you have to pay attention to. You have to zone in, and it's not the kind of book you want to read in a hurry. You want to take your time with it. It's so much happening that I feel like if you rush through it, or if you don't take your time, then you're missing out on the experience that you could have in this world and in this book, and hopefully in this series. So like I said, I did enjoy it. It did drag at times. There's a lot of characters. I did struggle through parts of it. I had to go back and reread things. But overall, I think the format, the storytelling, the writing is more accessible than Gardens of the Moon. So if you did get through Gardens of the Moon and you're not sure about Deadhouse Gates, there is a big difference. There's a big change in tone and in writing. But this book is, I was really surprised how dark it was. I mean, like I said, I dig it, but I was really surprised how dark and violent it is. And it does bring up some really interesting questions about war, about survivors, about battles, about the things you take away from those things. It does present lots of questions. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler, but because there are battles, and the battle scenes are different in these books. The way Steven Erikson writes them is unique to me. I usually don't really care for action scenes that drag on, but his action scenes don't really feel like pure action scenes, because a lot of things happen. It's not focused in on the actions that are happening. It's focused in on the story and the action within the story. It's hard to explain. I wish I could break this down better for you, but the action scenes have a different feeling to them, and they feel like they focus in on moments in time and how those moments fall into the rest of the story. It's a different type of action that I enjoy. And like I said, action scenes usually are times when I kind of zone out and just kind of skim through if there's too many of them. But these ones, I was hooked on all of them. I didn't ever feel like I was bored or like, oh, here comes another action scene. So we are having a group read for this series, and I'm into it. I think it is, it's like I said, it's a challenge, but I'm enjoying it so far. I think it's challenging the way that I read, my reading habits, the way that I absorb stories. I think it's a really interesting experience for me personally. So if you are curious, give it a shot. Maybe you'll enjoy it. So have you read Deadhouse Gates? If you have, let me know down below what you thought of it. As always, I hope this review was helpful. Until next time, I will talk to you soon.